Hey guys, Budcat7 here. Okay, it is Thursday, September 23rd, 2021, and I'd like to thank you for visiting the Stonewall Research channel here on YouTube. I really do appreciate it. Alright, guys, well, in this video, we are going to take a look at an archaeological site, or several sites, on the island of Bahrain, which is in the Persian Gulf, just off the coast of Saudi Arabia, and just northwest of the nation of Qatar here, which is also in the Persian Gulf there. And the reason why this site is so important is because it fits into sort of a Sumerian culture and history as being sort of the place of the creation, uh, as noted by scholars who look into Sumerian history. But the interest in it for me was that it was a mound site. There's a mound site. There's several mound sites there that tumuli that are in the hundreds of thousands here. So when I heard about it, I thought, wow, this would be a very interesting site to take a look at. And here's a sort of aerial view of one of the areas there in Bahrain. Some other pictures here. You can see these mounds of really literally hundreds here in this picture here. There are thousands, hundreds of thousands of them on the island there, but I don't think there's many of them left. Maybe only like 20,000 of them left because, of all the development there. But it's the UNESCO site, but even so, I don't know what they're doing to enforce, the preservation of these things. But another reason why I'm doing the video is because it sort of demonstrates the sort of confusion and bewilderment and befuddlement that going to occur when you read about these things, because they just don't know a lot about it, but yet they're going to hand you a whole story about it, which, doesn't make any sense. It seems to me like this is one of those sites, or the sites there on Bahrain, that they attribute to the Dilmun culture, which were sort of contemporary culture with the Sumerian culture at some stage, that they seem to know, but again, they don't know a lot, and they don't know a lot about anything, even Sumeria too. It's just a lot of this stuff is just hypothetical and theoretical, and a lot of supposing by people. But again, the language that's used doesn't, as we find out when we read more about it, that these are not really mounds at all, and it's not a mound building culture whatsoever. So it's still very interesting, but saying that they're mounds, we sort of expect it to be a mound building culture, but it's not. So let's read about it. I'll talk about it a little bit, and about how, this sort of contemporary archaeology is just so lacking in any specifics, and yet, they could make up spin a whole yarn about it that is probably complete fantasy by whoever it is that's doing the supposing. So let's read about these Dilmun burial mounds. Again, this is what they look like. The royal mounds are sort of within the town here, but they preserve them. But again, these are not mounds really. And you can see they just number in the hundreds of thousands. Some areas they just stretch out across the land there. So it's very interesting site. But what is it, and who are we referring to, and what time periods And we can think of other things we've learned about with the mound building cultures, for example, that were going on in similar time periods. So let's read about it a little bit and talk about it a little bit. The Dilmun burial mounds are a UNESCO World Heritage Site comprising necropolis areas on the main island of Bahrain dating back to the Dilmun and the al-Nar culture. So there's two cultures attributed to it. Again, this site, like many sites around the world, and including especially the South American sites, shows evidence of one culture building on top of another culture and adding on to what was already there. And, in some cases where they just know this, in other places, like, for example, in Peru, what they attribute to the Inca, and in Central America, what they attribute to the Maya really wasn't done by those peoples at all. Those are the people who stumbled upon that stuff later on. And it seems to me like this site is also an example of it, and maybe even evidence of reconstruction using repurposed materials from much finer built structures that were there from the ancient past. So let's read about, we'll talk about it. Bahrain has been known since ancient times as an island with a very large number of burials. The originally quite a number of square kilometers of mounds were said to be one of the largest cemeteries in the ancient world. The cemeteries are concentrated in the north of the island and on the hard stony areas slightly above the arable farming soils. The south of the island is mainly sandy and desert-like. Recent studies have shown that the estimated approximately 350,000 ancient grave mounds could have been solely produced by the local population over a number of thousands of years. The graves are not, you see, it says vague there in this little notation here. Yeah, like much of the research into this. The graves are not all of the same era or of exactly the same styles and can vary considerably in size in different areas of the mound field. Research under the auspices of the Bahrain National Museum is still continuing to establish a firm timeline for all these variations and continuations, as well as considering the implications for the society or societies that produce them. So, in other words, they know almost nothing about any of this stuff. Yet they're going to say all sorts of things about it that seem like they're positive, and they're not. Excavations between Sunday the 10th and Tuesday the 19th of February 1889, some of the mounds were excavated by the British explorer J. Theodore Bent and his wife Mabel Bent. According to the diary of Mrs. Bent, they found bits of ivory, charcoal, ostrich eggshell. These finds are now in the British Museum, London. Theodore Bent published his result in two articles, but a more extended account appeared in the Bent's book, Southern Arabia, 1900. A Danish group in the 1950s was excavating at Kalat al-Bahrain, the capital city of the Bronze Age, when they opened some tumuli and discovered items dating to around 4100 to 3700 BP of the same culture. Many others began to excavate more of the graves, providing a view of the construction and content on these graves. Chambers, tumuli. Each of the tumuli is composed of a central stone chamber that is enclosed by a low ring wall and covered by earth and gravel. The size of the mounds varies, but the majority of them measures 15 by 30 feet, 4.5 by 9 meter in diameter, and are 3 to 6 feet, 1 to 2 meter high. The smaller mounds usually contain only one chamber. The chambers are usually rectangular with one or two alcoves at the northeast end. Occasionally, there are additional pairs of alcoves along the middle of the larger chambers. Although the chambers usually contain one burial each, some contain several people, and the secondary chambers often contain none. The deceased were generally laid with their heads in the alcove end of the chamber and lying on their right sides. The bodies were accompanied by few items. There were a few pieces of pottery and occasionally shell or stone stamp seals, baskets sealed with asphalt, ivory objects, stone jars, and copper weapons. The skeletons are representative of both sexes with a life expectancy of approximately 40 years. Babies were generally buried at and outside the ring wall. The average number of children per family was 1.6 persons. Okay, so for a site they don't know a lot about, they know this much, I guess. But even so, they're not giving any sort of measurements on these skeletal remains. How big were these people? That's important information to know in a world in a past where people of such slight stature. These are one of the things that should be of primary interest to archaeologists and anthropologists and anybody doing any studies here, but no mention of it. But we'll take a look at one of the skeletal remains anyway, and they seem a bit curious to me. But okay, so we're getting an idea of how these sepulchres were constructed and then, I guess, buried with these mounds on top of them, and they've lasted all these thousands and thousands and thousands of years, we assume, by what we've read so far. But let us read on here. Conservation controversies. Attempt to protect the burial mounds have run into opposition by religious fundamentalists who consider them un-Islamic and have called for them to be concreted over for housing. During a parliamentary debate on 17th July 2005, the leader of the Salafist Al-Asala party, Sheikh Adel Moda, said, "Housing for the living is better than the graves for the dead. We must have pride in our Islamic roots and not some ancient civilization from another place and time, which has only given us a jar here and a bone there." So apparently that's how the religious people in Bahrain feel about these things. And they just as soon concrete it all over and build right on top of it. So naturally, we have no idea of what the past actually was. But let's read more about it, because this Wikipedia article doesn't tell us everything or much about anything as it is, and they don't know a lot as it is. But let's read on a little bit more about it at this UNESCO page here and talk a little bit more in depth about it. The Dilmun burial mounds. The Dilmun burial mounds, built between 2200 and 1750 BCE, span over 21 archaeological sites in the western part of the island. 6 of these sites are burial mound fields consisting of a few dozen to several thousand tumuli. In all, there are about 11,774 burial mounds, originally in the form of cylindrical low towers. Okay, so that was its original form. Originally in the form of cylindrical low towers. Okay, so that was the original form. And then I guess they were covered with dirt afterwards. The other 15 sites include 17 royal mounds constructed as 2-story sepulchral towers. The burial mounds are evidence of the early Dilmun civilization around the 2nd millennium BCE, during which Bahrain became a trade hub whose prosperity enabled the inhabitants to develop an elaborate burial tradition applicable to the entire population. These tombs illustrate globally unique characteristics, not only in terms of their number, density, and scale, but also in terms of details such as burial chambers equipped with alcoves. Okay, well, not really, because we read about so many of these burial mounds in the Americas that also had stone construction similar to these on the insides of that, including complete rooms, with everything in it. So, you know, I don't think so, but they were originally constructed as cylindrical low towers and two-story towers, and then they got dirt on them somehow. So something to think about there is to actually, the purpose of it too. And as far as what they found in the soils there, again, we know from our own investigations here on this channel and learning about the mounds that the mounds are constructed with engineered soil or engineered material, earthen material with stuff mixed in it to maintain the structural integrity of the forms that they were creating. And, engineered soils figure heavily into the ancient peoples of the Americas. Just interesting to find out that, elsewhere in the world where we find mounds, you have similar things going on. So, mounds are not just simply built out of dirt. It's a soil mixture, an engineered soil mixture. And again, we find sort of evidence of that here with what they found in the soils, whether it be ostrich feathers or whatever it is. They mixed all sorts of stuff together to create a building material. So they just mentioned again these couple of things about how they were built originally. Archaeological evidence shows that the burial sites were originally not constructed as mounds, but as cylindrical low towers. The royal mounds, characterized by their pronounced sizes and elaborate burial chambers, were constructed as two-storied sepulchral towers forming a ziggurat-like shape. Okay, so they weren't constructed as mounds originally. Okay, why did they become mounds later on? Okay, this is sort of vague and nebulous um, description of these things. That what are we getting out of this? So, are they mounds, or is this a mound building culture or not? Or are these considered burial mounds or not? Because that's not what they were originally intended as. You're reading it right here from the UNESCO article on it. Okay, so, and there's a reason why I'm saying also mentioning all of this, because we have Göbekli Tepe, right, which is considered much far older than this, but yet it was supposedly buried, by hand. And here we have another instance of that occurring over here, but it looks totally different than Göbekli Tepe. Of course, the sizes are different, but they have rather large ones here all over the place. As you can see from a lot of these pictures, there's huge ones there, and other earthworks as well, which they neglect to mention. So here's a cross section of what they're talking about, these cylindrical things. And you see the stone construction is rather crude, although it's very well organized, right? You have to think about these things again when looking at this stuff, because you have to sort of reckon things together here, because things don't make sense sometimes. And this is one of those times. So here's another, you know, I'm thinking to myself, were they buried by hand, really? Or did something cover them up? Some occurrence, some cataclysmic occurrence that was going on there, and a layer so thick was put on everything, level ground, built up a couple of feet, and the mounds, these towers got the dirt on them and whatever, and it made them look like mounds. And then maybe a later culture assumed that they were mounds and then built their own mounds. You see how these things make mistakes could be made, and I firmly believe, and I don't care what the German archaeologist there at the Göbekli Tepe says, it was covered by electrical discharge, interplanetary electrical discharge, because you can see it from the lake that's above Göbekli Tepe, giant lake that's up there. This is created by electrical discharge, geoformed by electrical discharge, like so many places on the planet, as we know through the Thunderbolts project. Okay, it wasn't covered by hand. The material that's on Göbekli Tepe comes from 40 miles away. There was no reason to go 40 miles to get the material, just general material to cover up Göbekli Tepe. But just so happens that 40 miles away is this giant lake that looks kind of artificial even today. All right, so were these things, covered by hand, or were they covered up by some occurrence? Okay, do we know? Okay, so they identify some of these Dilmun kings in the royal mounds there, 8 and 10. The Dilmun burial mounds illustrate globally unique characteristics not only with regards to their numbers, density, and scale, but also in terms of construction typology and details, such as their alcove-equipped burial chambers. But again, we've heard of similar things occurring here in the Americas with the giants. Okay. So it says here the Dilmun burial mounds represent unique sepulchral testimony to the early Dilmun civilization over a period of 450 years, as remains of settlements are scarce and buried under thick layers of soil. See that? Okay. Where there's so many other archaeological sites in the world didn't have anything on top of them for thousands of years. Wasn't this buildup of cultural layers and all that kind of stuff, and general natural layers? They seem to be free of that, but in other areas around the planet, Peru and Egypt and all sorts of areas, evidence of the mud floods or anything else that could have occurred in the past to cover all these things up. Like I say, Göbekli Tepe and interplanetary electrical discharge. But you see here what it's saying. It's, thick layers of soil covering these things where, you go elsewhere in the world, there's nothing there. So, they got that all wrong anyway, these cultural layers and all nonsense. It's all guesswork and theory and everything. The Dilmun burial mounds are the most extensive and most apparent evidence of the early Dilmun culture. At the time, the newly gained prosperity allowed the island's ancient inhabitants to develop an elaborate burial tradition applicable to the entire population. The excavated mounds provide a cross section of various social groups in the early Dilmun society, attesting to thousands of individuals of different age, gender, and social class. They also offer crucial evidence on the evolution of elites and ruling classes. The ancient inhabitants of Bahrain understood that the special geological configuration of the island and used less fertile land for the development of these extraordinary cemeteries. Okay, so there's 5 different mound types give clues about the emergence of social hierarchies. Even though the burial mounds can be divided according to variations in size and interior design, the basic layout of the mounds remains the same throughout the 450-year period. The construction typology is exceptional. The majority of the tombs were constructed as single-storied small cylindrical towers, while some of the bigger two-story examples were built in a ziggurat-like shape. Okay, so the towers were built, okay, that way, not the mounds. Okay, so again, there's just a whole confusing thing here, whether these are mounds or towers, or what should we think of them? Are they mounds, or are they towers that were buried later on, or they were buried intentionally? None of this is clear at all. A very particular and unique characteristic of the Dilmun tumuli construction is the presence of alcoves. Depending on the occupant's social status, there can be up to 6 of such alcoves, which are usually filled with mortuary gifts. Okay, these are all the things that UNESCO goes over here about it, but doesn't tell you a whole lot about anything here. And this is just the few sites in Bahrain, although it's substantial, where they have these burial mounds. But I want to know about any other sort of um, archaeological sites that are associated with the Dilmun culture there that we could take a look at that were more substantial, or we could get more info out of. And you also have this other site there called the Barbar Temple. Okay, and here's a picture of some of the construction in it. And again, looking at this just in general, here's another picture here. Okay, from Alamy here, you can see this sort of you know stone masonry that's going with fitted block. Okay, and I always wonder why, if you have the ability to cut stone, wouldn't you just make every single one of them, the same dimensions? I often wonder why. And that's why I get the feeling that even at this level, or however many thousands of years ago that it was, okay, that this thing right here could very well possibly be constructed from repurposed stone, okay, because so many things in this construction here don't make any sense. It's not polygonal construction, although it sort of resembles it in some ways, but it's not. It's relatively flat and square block. Okay, so if you have the ability to cut block square like this, why would you have this jumble of blocks going on here? Okay, so I'm getting the feeling that this was made from repurposed stone, and what we're actually looking at is some culture, but not the earliest culture that was there, that was putting this stuff together here. And I just want to take, like this, for example, here. Just doesn't make any sense. You have the ability to cut flat stone, okay? Perfectly cut stone, okay? You have the ability to do that. Why would you do all this stuff here? You can see how it's fitted here. This corner is fitted right here. Okay, like polygonal stone masonry. You have gaps in between these rather large blocks here, filled in by another cut block. It seems, although this looks like a little different color here, but why would you do that? Well, if you have the ability to cut the stone, and you know, wouldn't you make it like all the same dimension? Or at least, if you could think of it, if you had those abilities, you'd certainly build a better wall than this, you know? But yet, this is considered one of the Dilmun temples. So they had the ability to cut limestone like this, okay? But yet, their wall looks so crummy here. Does that make any sense to anybody? See, this is a problem I have with these sites. It just doesn't, things don't drive up here. Okay, although it could be that these people were repurposing block or whatever it is, maybe somewhere in their memory they had the ability to still cut rock, or at least close to it or whatever. But they had to repurpose most of the stone because they didn't have the ability to just churn out cut limestone block like this. Okay, like some of these seem like they're the same dimension here. If you look at some of the blocks, Some of it looks like some of the block is like of the same dimension where, it just looks like a jumble of it, but they look very close in size, some of these blocks, right? Like this and this right here, this one here with this one and this one here, this one here. It seems to me like all this stuff could have been taken from some far older structure there on the island and repurposed to create these quote unquote temples. Although in this Bar temple, which you'll read about, there's a natural spring in there. Let's see. Here's just some other pictures of it. So this clump of rocks there is attributed to the temple here. We see some of these look almost like they're evenly cut. And some of these have, like, you can see here, like rounded out sections on the bottom of it here, which is face down here. So again, I'm getting the vibe that this is repurposed material from some other structure that was destroyed or something like that, from some far previous older. And the Dilmun culture is not the oldest culture there on the island. There's some far older culture there that they don't know anything about. Okay, everything is buried under layers of soil and sand and all that kind of stuff. And it's just all of this stuff is like complete fantasy on their part. They have to put something together that drives up with their timeline and what they know. So they got to make up some kind of story. But just remember, folks, it's all made up. All made up. We say, well, we're qualified to make up stories about the past because we went to college. You did? Oh, goody. Well, that doesn't make it infallible, okay? And as far as we know about the disciplines of archaeology and anthropology, those are relatively new sciences. You know, it hasn't been like they've been around for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. We got it down like math or something like that, or geometries. We don't. You know, we're still like cavemen here. Okay, and you can see around these sites too, like this, for example. Okay, so you see the stonework of whoever that was in the past cutting these perfectly cut limestone blocks here. Again, why wouldn't you make them all the same dimension? Isn't it a lot easier to build when you have all the same dimension block? Okay, repurpose, folks. Don't let him fool you and don't let him kid you. The Dilmun culture is probably not the oldest culture that was there. Again, these Dilmun people, whatever, probably stumbled upon this stuff later on, repurposed it, built it as this nonsense here, okay, from what they found laying around, okay? And this is stuff on the top here. This is what they were really capable of, not this. See? Anybody capable of this is going to build something perfect. Okay? Not this. Don't you get that? All right? Do I have to make it any more clear to you? It's not what they say it is. Again, most of these things are not what they say it is. And here's the Wikipedia article, which shows you one crummy little picture that doesn't tell you a damn thing about it. But they're doing it on purpose, folks. Okay, there's probably Western archaeologists and anthropologists overseeing these studies and whatnot, and they're telling these people, whatever. Yeah, we don't know much about it, but we're going to tell you all about it, and just forget about it and shut up and listen to what we say. The Bar Temple is an archaeological site located in the village of Bar, Bahrain, considered to be part of the Dilmun culture. The most recent of the three Bar temples was rediscovered by a Danish archaeological team in 1954. A further two temples were discovered on the site, with the oldest dating back to 3000 BC. Okay, so that's going way back in time with these perfectly cut stone blocks, unlike the Sumerians, which, made their temples out of brick, mud brick, etc., etc. So these people are cutting limestone blocks. All right. The temples were built of limestone blocks believed to have been carved out of from Jeddah Island. Okay. They weren't cut now. They were carved. Okay. See where Wikipedia sort of obfuscates, what we would consider common sense. Okay, they weren't carved out of anything. They were cut precisely from Jeddah Island, if that's where they came from. Okay, so let's read about the three temples here. The three temples were built atop one another, with the second built approximately 500 years later, and the third added between 2100 BC and 2000 BC. Okay, quite a long ways back. It is thought that the temples were constructed to worship the god Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, and his wife Nankur Sak. The temple contains two altars and a natural water spring that is thought to have held spiritual significance for the worshippers. Or just water is life. I guess you can pray to that or everything, but you could also come there and get a drink too, I would guess. All right. During the excavation of the site, many tools, weapons, pottery, and small pieces of gold were found, which are now on display in the Bahrain National Museum. The most famous find was a copper bull's head. And I think they show that here. I don't know if they show that here or not. I thought they did, but somewhere you can see it, this copper bull head. Oh, there it is on, their little sign there. All right, so a mask. It's like a mask, bullhead. Okay, so they're talking about the temples that were built on top of the earliest temple, but again, this earliest temple seems to be something with more precisely cut, perfectly cut limestone block, and as you go up, it gets more crude and mortar and small stone, etc., etc. So we're devolving here, like most of the sites around the world, like the Mayan, Rio back, and the Inca stuff, and all the sites down there in Peru. Everything on top of the sites gets more and more primitive, and as far back you go in time, further back you go in time, gets more precise, like this finely cut stone block. Just look at it, okay? You're telling me the same peoples at a later date did this? This is what they were doing first, and then they got dumber or something like that, and then they did this? No, okay? There's probably a multitude of things going on. The culture that actually built what we're looking at here looks to me like they repurposed something else. Because if they could cut stone like this, they don't need to do any of this stuff. And whatever it is they're going to create is going to be perfect. You understand that, right? Okay, so it wasn't them. Okay, so, but whoever built this may not necessarily be the same people here, right? They repurposed all that, and then when they ran out of that perfectly cut block there, this is what they did. Mr. Davis's shop class work on top of it, right? So that makes sense to you, right? Well, it doesn't make any sense to me. So this is just another one of these sites showing that the further back in time you go, the more advanced cultures were. Not what we've always believed and what they taught us in school, that the further back in time you go, the more primitive peoples are. Wrong. There's no evidence of that at all. There seems to be a lot of evidence showing back the further back you go in time, the more advanced cultures are in their building techniques and engineering skills. Okay? Why you fibbing to us, bro? Okay? Make up your mind. Okay? You can't show us this and say, well, then they built this and then they built this stuff on top of it. Okay? And we're supposed to say, yeah, sure, that makes sense. Of course it doesn't. But that's what they're going to tell us because they don't know. You see? And they think we're stupid on top of it. Temple 2 is most livable still, with retaining walls and terraces stiffs. First stage, the oval terrace was built in local stone, but after an enlargement, it was built in limestone, which must have been carried by boat from nearby Jeddah Island, where stone was hewn out by hand and carefully dressed into remarkably neat masonry blocks. The skill with which this task was carried out may be clearly seen in the temple walls and especially around the sacred well. A double circular altar and offering table stood in the center of the shrine. To the south, there were three cult stones shaped like the anchors of the merchant ships. Although the central one bore a protruding animal head like the altars depicted on the seals. A temple treasure lay in the stone framed pit in the northeast corner. The central terrace was crowned by a shrine built of cut stone with stone paving. Smaller buildings clustered around it, covering the rest of the terrace. It seems this is a bad translation. How they allow a bad translation in there, right? Terrible. There were no, but I guess we'll have to thank whoever it is because otherwise we know nothing. There There were no buildings on the outer oval terrace, but altars and cult symbols were visible. A plinth with recessed stone cylinder lay to the south, and a plinth with three pillars was situated near the northwest wall. A double row of plinths for cult objects lined both sides of the stairs from the upper terrace. On each of these plinths were two square holes lined with bitumen and sheet copper nailed to wood. Here may have stood copper mounted poles with emblems of gods, so often seen on the stamp seals, or perhaps wooden statues. Okay, so here's some holes made in the stone that would accompany, permit accessories to be installed in them. So always wondering what all these holes are on the faces of walls and columns and everything everywhere. And it seems to me that they probably were other decorative things placed in those things that are long since gone because they're, made of, organic material that broke down quick and the stone didn't. But it just shows you what they're saying here is probably correct. And just lined with sheet copper. There may have stood copper mounted poles with emblems of gods. So copper mounted poles with emblems of gods, okay, or symbols of authority. Halfway down the stair was a portal, and from there the stair was roofed. The rich natural spring which filled the pool probably accounts for this sighting of the temple at Barbar. Water poured from the perforated stone jar beside a semicircular stone font at the threshold of a dry chamber near the basin. From the corners of the shrine, deep stone built channels led the water to surrounding fields and gardens. Okay, so this is an agricultural society, obviously, some 3,000 years ago, not a hunter gatherer one. Okay, so here's evidence of a quote unquote mound building culture, which it isn't. We know it's not mound builders, they were all cylindrical stone structures that were covered somehow with dirt that they don't explain fully. Are you going to have that? Why would you cover it with dirt? Doesn't make a lot of sense. But, we have tombs today, right? They're above ground. We don't bury them underground so nobody can see them, right? If you're building these great tombs and all this kind of stuff. But beside the fact that these things, at least from this time period, they're not made with these finely cut stone. If your culture is capable of that, everything is built that way, not just the temples. Why would you do it for the temple and not your own house? Doesn't make sense, right? So more stuff that doesn't make sense. This remarkable underground shrine is interpreted as a symbolic Abzu, the abode of Enki, the god of wisdom and of all fresh water. The Abzus was believed to be an oval sacrificial core connected with a central temple platform by a paved ramp and staircase. It was believed to be Everything is believed to be. It may have, it could be. Yeah, you could suppose into infinity. Anybody could. You don't have to be a professional academic to do supposing. And we don't need them either. Okay? Anybody could do supposing. You don't need an Ivy League education for that. The floor of the court was covered with ashes and the bones of cattle and sheep, presumably sacrificed animals. At what time period? Do you know? Did you get any carbon dating on those? No, we're just going to say anything. And the third temple, in use until the early centuries of the second millennium, was larger than its predecessors. Two circular offering tables of finely cut stone with a low altar between them still stand in the middle of the courtyard. Note the three standing stone blocks pierced with a round hole. It is thought that these were tethering points for the sacrificial animals. The third temple's terrace was probably about 30 square meters. Okay, so who knows if those things found in the courtyard there are from the time period. They say there's no way of proving that. They can be moved there at any time. It's ridiculous, okay? Their supposing for this is completely amateur. Okay, any amateur can do all the supposing for this stuff. You don't need professional academics, and as far as I'm concerned, they don't know shit about this site. Okay, just totally obfuscated. Are they mounds or are they cylindrical uh you know constructions? Make up your mind. They weren't originally built as that, so why call them mounds? I don't get it. Are they originally built as these cylindrical constructions, stone constructions, and then made into tumuli? I mean, why even mention it? That they're the ones who say are separating the two things, right? They're the ones that are saying it, right? So, look, I'm just pointing this out. My interest in was is that this was a possible mound building culture, but I'm not getting that out of it. Okay, they're not what they say it is. Okay, what they were built as, what they ended up as, what time periods, they're different ones. Okay, so it says right here, most of the tumuli, if that's what they are, I don't know, can't pin it out in this article. It just said in a previous paragraph that they weren't built as mounds originally. So are they mounds or not? I mean, because burial mound is a specific thing. Okay, if they were not built as that to begin with, then they're not really mounds. Why say they're mounds? It's sort of misdirecting what it really is. There should be a caveat about that. They weren't built as mounds. So once you say that, once you add that to the title, mounds, but you know, not originally built as such, or in quotes, or something like that. Okay, so it says here, as a result of previous development activities, the setting has lost parts of its integrity. So, just another ancient site around the world, guys, that they don't know anything about, that they're rapidly destroying. And again, are we going to be able to find out what our past is really all about? You see, these blocks here are not in the same sort of level of refinement as these at the Barber Temple, okay? And if you can cut stone block like this, there's no reason to do this kooky cockamamie building method here. Just cut them all the same size. Or on the way to interlock, you have the ability to cut the stone like this. Why would you do this? It's nonsense. Okay, guys? whatever culture this was, it's not the Dilmun culture. And if it was the Dilmun culture, they repurposed something else from another culture. They didn't do any of the stuff. And then when they ran out of this kind of stone or whatever, they went back to building like this. Mr. Davis's shop class. All right. So I just wanted to take a look at this site, guys, because this is a perfect example of another place. I think, like in blatant ways, it makes most sense to me that it's another one of these ancient sites around the planet that more advanced is further back in time that you go, and something happened to make all of the human race have amnesia and not know how to build things anymore or cut stone or make stone or whatever it is. Okay. We have evidence of that around the whole planet here, and yet we're still handed this story by mainstream academics. So this is the timeline, how it goes. You know, cavemen were inventing corn, but they couldn't figure out what kind, if they should wear shoes or not, and running around, with bones in their nose, chasing woolly mammoths and all this kind of other stuff. Even though they only found evidence for that at 14 sites out of 74 in the Americas. Okay, they don't know what they're talking about, folks. The past to If you don't know it by now, the past is nothing like you imagine it is. Okay, all the talk about prehistoric times and cave, all nonsense when they say it occurred. And if it ever occurred, it could be so far in this so far distant past. Is mind boggling how far in the past that may have been. Okay. And even if we weren't around, it we just popped up out of nowhere for some reason, right? More of the past that they just don't know anything about. It's a complete fantasy, folks. Stop thinking in those terms, all right? And don't let any History Channel or TV program tell you what history is, okay? And forget about the mainstream academics, okay? If they don't, after researching this stuff, if they threw their hands up in the air and said, you know what? We looked over all this and we can't figure it out. The timeline doesn't make sense. The constructions don't make any sense. Finally constructed stuff here looks like, the worst piece of junk construction over here. Or, why would that happen? You can't say any of that stuff. They have to go back to their bosses with something. So they make a whole story to put a smile on the head of the department there's face, and go have coffee at the luncheonette afterwards. So look, guys, I just wanted to show you this to point out how they just don't have any understanding of the past at all of this stuff. And when you look at other sites, when you look at all the other sites that you see and people talk about on YouTube, on the internet, or whatever, they're so similar to this site in with respect that whoever found this stuff, these perfectly cut stones, found them. There was a far older culture there in the past, a more advanced culture, and who knows how advanced. Don't know it. Okay. And they're not going there because they can't. They'll get kicked out of university if they do. So they all stay nice and well behaved within the boundaries of the crappy science that they've done so far and stuff, just to maintain their stupid idea of the past, their sophomoric idea of the past. Okay? So, anyway, guys, I hope you learned something from this, or you could think about some of these things, okay? When you're looking at this site, when you're looking at other sites, is it what they say it is? I don't think so, okay? And even they admit what it is, they're using the wrong language. If they weren't built originally as mounds, then they're not mounds. Mounds are built in a certain way. Okay? And we find all these ancient sites, half of them, and all these ancient sites covered up with dirt for some reason. Where, you go a few hundred miles and there's another ancient site that's not covered up with anything. So where are the cultural layers there? Where they happen in one place but not another place that's nearby, relatively? Doesn't make any sense. So, in any case, guys, think about all these things and keep them in mind when you're doing your research and your studying of these subjects and topics like mounds, for instance, okay? And what it could mean and what these cultures were and if it's what they say it is. I don't think anything that they said about these things, even if it is Dilmun and all that, they're not there, folks. Any 12th grader could make up this story, folks. You don't need a college education to make up this story, okay? They don't know. Like, they don't know a lot about the past. So stop listening to them or even holding a little bit of it in your mind because they're wrong, all right? Anyway, guys, please do hit the like button if you like the video, and please do subscribe because we cover some very different ways of thinking on this channel than you'll ever experience on any other YouTube channel, or very few, if any. All right, guys. Anyway, Bugcat7 signing out. Peace.